Oscar Peterson was, by the consensus of the musicians who played alongside him and the critics who covered jazz most carefully across the second half of the 20th century, one of the most technically complete pianists who had ever sat at the instrument. The speed, the harmonic vocabulary, the specific quality of his touch, the ability to navigate complex material at tempos that challenged his peers, these were not disputed characteristics of his playing. They were simply what he could do, observed by anyone who heard him, and described by those who heard him with the specific vocabulary of people who had heard a great deal of jazz piano and understood what they were encountering. He had studied everything. He had absorbed the complete history of jazz piano, from the stride tradition through bebop and beyond, with the thoroughness of someone who understood that technical mastery required not just practice, but the kind of historical comprehension that gave technique its context. He knew how everything worked. He could hear what anyone was doing and account for it, could identify the lineage, place the influence, understand the mechanics of an approach well enough to reproduce it if he chose to. He had this capacity about the piano, which was his instrument, and about music more broadly, which was his domain. And he said that Louis Armstrong, a trumpet player, not a pianist, an artist working in a different instrumental tradition, a man of an earlier generation, had changed how he thought about playing the piano. The statement requires some examination, because it is not the kind of statement that explains itself immediately. The influence of a trumpet player on a pianist is not the most obvious path of musical transmission. The specific things that a trumpet does, the way it shapes sound, the relationship between breath and note, the physical constraints of the embouchure, the particular possibilities and limitations of a single-line melodic instrument, are not the things that a pianist encounters when they sit at the keyboard. The piano has 88 keys, 2 hands, the capacity for harmony and counterpoint, and the simultaneous production of multiple independent musical lines. The trumpet has 1. And yet Peterson said Armstrong had changed how he played. Not that Armstrong had inspired him. Inspiration is a general and somewhat vague category, meaning little more than that someone's work produced a positive response. He said changed how he played, which is a specific claim about something specific, that there was a before and an after, and that the after was different from the before in a way that could be heard by anyone who was listening carefully enough. To understand what Peterson meant, it is necessary to understand what Armstrong was doing, what the specific quality of his playing was in the years when Peterson was hearing him, that produced an effect in a listener who was not a trumpet player, and who was, by the mid-1950s, already one of the most accomplished pianists in jazz. The answer is not, as the simple version of the story might suggest, that Armstrong had a beautiful tone, or an unusual technique, or a remarkable improvisational vocabulary, though all of these things were true. The answer is something more fundamental than technique. It has to do with the relationship between what the music is and what the person playing it knows about the music, with the specific quality of inhabitation that distinguishes a musician who is playing music from a musician who has become the music, temporarily and completely, in the way that the best performances of the best musicians achieve. The evening when Oscar Peterson heard Armstrong play in a small club without announcement, as a musician with an evening off and a professional's particular quality of attention available to direct at whatever was happening on the stage, was not, by Peterson's account, a dramatic event at the time it occurred. He went to hear Armstrong. Armstrong played. He listened. The drama was what happened in the subsequent weeks and months when Peterson returned to the piano and found that what he was doing was different in a specific way that he had not been doing it before. Not different in the grand, transformative sense of a musician who has had a conversion experience and has reorganized everything about their playing around what they discovered. Different in the more quiet and more durable sense of a musician who has heard something they hadn't heard before, and who finds, over time, that what they heard has made a specific adjustment in how they approach the instrument, an adjustment that cannot be fully articulated, but that can be heard by anyone who is listening carefully enough to notice the before and the after. What the adjustment was, in specific technical terms, is something that Peterson described in various interviews with the characteristic difficulty of musicians trying to explain the unteachable parts of their craft. He talked about the relationship between technical capacity and musical honesty, about the way that technical ability, at the highest levels, can become a barrier rather than a tool, can produce in a player the temptation to demonstrate what they can do rather than simply doing what the music requires. He said that Armstrong's playing had no demonstration in it, that there was no part of what Armstrong played that was there to show what he could do. Every note was there because the music required it, and for no other reason. This was, for a pianist of Peterson's technical capacity, a pianist who was, by the standards of what jazz piano could do in the mid-1950s, capable of more things than almost anyone who had ever sat at the instrument, a specific and difficult lesson. Because the temptation to demonstrate is proportional to the capacity for demonstration. A musician who has developed the ability to do things that most musicians cannot do is a musician who has constant access to the choice of whether to deploy that ability for its own sake or in service of the music. Armstrong's playing was a demonstration of what that choice looked like when it was consistently and completely made in favor of the music. Peterson did not stop playing with technical brilliance after hearing Armstrong. That would be to misread the lesson. The lesson was not, play less than you're capable of. The lesson was, make sure that what you play is there because the music requires it. The technical capacity is in service of that requirement. It is not the point. This is, as Peterson understood, a lesson that is easy to state and genuinely difficult to practice. Difficult because the technical capacity is present and the temptation to use it is constant, and the music sometimes genuinely does require everything you have. The discipline is in the judgment, in the specific, real-time assessment of what the music is calling for, and the willingness to do exactly that and nothing more. Armstrong, in 50 years of playing, had arrived at the place where that judgment was no longer an effort. It was simply what he did. And Peterson heard it, and it changed how he thought about his own playing, which was the change he described, which was the lesson that crossed the distance between the trumpet and the piano. The quality that Oscar Peterson identified in Armstrong's playing, the quality that crossed the distance between the trumpet and the piano and produced in Peterson a revised understanding of his own instrument, was the quality that those who have written most carefully about Armstrong consistently describe as the defining thing about him: the complete absence in his playing of any perceptible gap between what he intended and what he produced. This is not as simple as it sounds. Every musician has this as a goal. The training and the practice and the accumulated hours of work at the instrument are all, at some level, in service of closing the gap between intention and production, between what you hear in your mind and what you are able to make the instrument do. The gap is never fully closed in most musicians, even very good ones. it remains perceptible. There is a quality in the playing of effort, of managing the instrument, of working toward rather than simply being at the point of arrival. In Armstrong's playing, by the time Peterson was hearing him in the 1950s, the gap was not perceptible. What came out of the trumpet was what Armstrong had heard, not approximately, not subject to the adjustments and corrections that the gap between intention and production produces in real time, but directly and completely. The instrument was not something Armstrong played. It was something Armstrong was. And the quality that this produced in the sound, the specific directness and completeness of it, the sense that what you were hearing had not been mediated by the process of production, but had simply arrived, was what Peterson identified as the thing that changed how he thought about his own playing. Because the gap between intention and production is not an instrument-specific problem, it is a musician-specific problem. The piano presents it differently than the trumpet. The physical constraints are different. The technical requirements are different. The way the instrument responds to the player is different. But the fundamental issue, the degree to which the playing is inhabited rather than managed, the degree to which the musician and the instrument have become the same thing rather than remaining two separate things in a productive relationship, is the same issue regardless of the instrument. Peterson heard in Armstrong's trumpet playing a demonstration of what complete inhabitation looked like. Not as a philosophical description of a musical ideal, but as a sonic fact, something he could hear in every note, in the specific quality of arrival of each sound, in the way the music moved without the quality of effort that even very skilled playing usually contains. And hearing it in that demonstration, he understood something about what he was working toward at the piano that the piano itself had not made available to him in the same clarity. Armstrong, playing the trumpet with the completeness that 50 years of work and natural ability and specific musical intelligence had produced, was showing Peterson, not intentionally, not as a teaching moment, simply by playing, what the destination looked like. And Peterson, who had the musical intelligence to understand what he was hearing, carried that demonstration back to the piano. The influence that Louis Armstrong exercised on musicians who played different instruments, who encountered his work not as colleagues working in the same idiom, but as listeners from adjacent idioms, who had the musical intelligence to hear what was being demonstrated, was one of the less documented but more significant dimensions of his impact on jazz as a whole. The standard account of Armstrong's influence is an account of what he showed trumpet players, the possibilities of the solo voice, the vocabulary of jazz improvisation, the specific relationship between melody and harmonic structure that his recordings of the 1920s established as a baseline that subsequent generations built from. This account is accurate. It is also incomplete. What Peterson's experience points to is a different kind of influence. The influence of a demonstration of complete musical inhabitation on anyone who had the capacity to understand what they were hearing, regardless of their instrument. Armstrong's playing was, in this sense, a model not for the trumpet specifically, but for the relationship between musician and instrument generally, for what it looked like when the gap between intention and production was closed, when the music and the person playing it were no longer distinguishable as separate things, when what arrived at the listener's ear was simply the music, carrying nothing extra and missing nothing necessary. Every musician who aspires to this, every musician who understands that the goal of their training is not technical mastery for its own sake, but the capacity to make the instrument disappear, to make it the transparent medium through which the music passes without friction, has something to hear in Armstrong's playing. The instrument doesn't matter. The lesson is the same. Peterson understood this. He understood it not as an abstract principle about musical aesthetics, but as a concrete reality he had heard in a specific evening in a jazz club, in the specific quality of a trumpet being played by a man who had been playing it for 50 years and who had arrived, through those 50 years, at the place where the trumpet and the music were the same thing. He carried that understanding back to the piano, and for the rest of his career, through the decades of playing that followed his encounter with Armstrong's work, through the recordings and the concerts and the specific moments of technical brilliance for which Peterson became celebrated, that understanding was present. Not always audible as a distinct thing, present as a quality of the playing, as the specific discipline of a musician who had been shown by a trumpet player what the destination looked like, and who had organized his entire relationship to his own instrument around arriving there. Oscar Peterson was one of the greatest pianists who ever lived. He said Louis Armstrong changed how he played the piano, not how he played the trumpet, how he played the piano, which is, in the specific world of jazz and its specific relationships between musicians and instruments and the transmission of knowledge across both, the highest thing that can be said about a musician's reach. Armstrong played the trumpet. He played it so completely that the people who heard him were changed by it, regardless of what instrument they played, which is what the music is for, which is what it has always been for, which is what Armstrong was always doing.